Our study of the book of Jude. We got through a little bit of what I consider the second kind of section of Jude, but I'd like to have someone reread it for us just for context, because it really all flows together. So someone quickly go ahead and read for us Jude verses 3 through 16, please. Jude 3 through 16. Whoever's got it, go ahead, please. Okay, so like I said at the top, we've gone through some of these verses already, but this is Jude kind of explaining why he's writing this letter. There's an issue coming in, there's these ungodly people, and he wants to write to fellow Christians to kind of explain what these ungodly people are doing, and then later on, when we get to verse 17 onward, he's going to explain what they need to do in response. So he's laying out right now the issue that is facing the church at this time. So he tells him to contend for the faith. We talked about that and what the sacrifice of Christ means as far as that faith goes. And then he begins to talk about some of these kind of Old Testament examples, if you will. So he's got several. He talks about the Hebrews that left Egypt, but later that whole generation died except for two men. That would be Caleb and Joshua. He talks about angels that disobeyed God, and we've talked about how those that abandoned their post or did not do their duties were punished for that. There was a judgment for them. And then we hadn't quite gotten to it yet, but we're going to talk about Sodom and Gomorrah, the example he brings up there, Cain, Balaam, and then Korah. He's using a lot of these examples. Presumably the people of the church, at least those who had a Jewish background, would understand these examples and would say, okay, he's saying, look out for people who do these kinds of things, and we can go back and we can read those because those things have been recorded. So he's making great references, and we'll go back and we'll read a little bit of kind of these things that he's talking about. We won't go into deep dives into them. It'd be too much for us to do, because each of these could be a study in and of themselves. But we're going to look at them just to see what he's talking about. And of course, I mentioned last week, 2 Peter chapter 2 is extremely similar to Jude. Like I almost jokingly say that it looks like he's plagiarizing Peter here because he says a lot of very, very similar things here. 2 Peter chapter 2, of course, is Peter warning about false teachers of that time. And I mean, he gives a lot of the same examples. He talks about angels that sinned. He talks about the people of the world before the flood. He talks about Sodom and Gomorrah. He talks about Balaam. And then he uses a lot of the same expressions. So it seems that Peter and Jude are really talking a lot about the same things. They're addressing the same problem here. So we're going to, of course, keep referring to 2 Peter chapter 2 as we did last week as we continue on. And I think that's a good summation of what we covered last week. Anything else before we continue on? We're going to start discussion in verse 7 is where we left off. Hello, Jeff.
It occurs to me as I think about the way the New Testament started. It started in an idyllic way, but the further you go, these books that are written later show that false teachers, false doctrine, false ideas are creeping more into the church, and things were not as perfect or as idyllic as they were in the beginning, and that's to be understood. So churches that are been around a long time sometimes will suffer these things. We sometimes feel like that once you get things set, you shouldn't have these kind of problems, but they will be there, and we have to always stay vigilant.
And I would say the first couple of chapters of Revelation, where John is writing to the 7 churches of Asia, he'll say, hey, you're doing great on this, but you're not doing this, or you're having a problem here. And that's one of the time-wise, one of the latest books that we could look at in the New Testament. And some of these churches, you think, well, this church, they've been around a while. They should be settled in. They should be strong. And I mean, John a little bit alludes to that they should be, but they're definitely having problems. One of the things we sometimes forget is that the church is made up of people, and over time, you have the older generation that goes, and then you have a new generation that comes up. And if that newer generation is not taught and does not have that same devotion that the first generation had, there's going to be problems that kind of have this cyclical reoccurrence. It's not unlike what we see in the book of Judges, where they're doing fine, then the next generation comes and they abandon God, and then bad things happen, so they call out to God, he sends a judge, things are good again, and then rinse and repeat, and it happens, several times over in the book of Judges. So not something new conceptually, but from our limited scope, just our own life experiences, it's hard for us to recognize that sometimes. And we all bring our own personal biases, thoughts, even if we don't mean to. And so Jude is he's going to write. He's not just addressing people who are just making mistakes and saying, oops, I didn't mean to. He's addressing people who are bringing sinful acts into the church and saying, this is okay, we can do this. We talked about that a little bit last week, that they're trying to use the mercy of God or the grace of God as a license for committing sins. And we talked about several verses, especially Romans, where it talks about that kind of thing. Go ahead, buddy, you had your hand up. Yeah, you don't tolerate. You don't say, well, this is okay, we'll let this slide. Paul talks about that to the Corinthians. They had all sorts of issues that they were just not addressing. Or they said this is fine, or it's not our problem. Paul says you can't just let this go. There has to be some kind of effort to address it, because if you don't address it, what happens? It gets worse. It does not get better on its own. You see a brother in sin, and you just say, well, I'll let him figure it out. What good is that to your brother? We're supposed to be helping each other out. We're supposed to be encouraging one another to do what's right. And when we're not doing that, what are we doing, essentially? What's the purpose of our meeting together? What's the purpose of being a church? What's the purpose of us trying to, call ourselves Christians, but then not trying to address the sins of our fellows who are claiming, at least, to also be Christians. So that definitely something we should not do is not do nothing, I guess, or don't do, not. I'm trying not to do double negatives, I'm sorry. You all know what I mean. Great. Any other comments before we go on? Okay, we're going to talk about verse 7 now. And let me make sure I got my correct notes here. There we go. Verse 7, I think it's verse 7. Here we go. Jude, he talks about the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. This is another Old Testament example he brings up. Now, Sodom and Gomorrah, there's actually a lot about Sodom and Gomorrah in the Bible. We're not going to go to every single place where it talks about it. Again, that could be its own study, and maybe someday that will be for us. But I'm just going to briefly kind of hit some points about it so we have enough background to see maybe what he's talking about here. Let's go to, we're going to read two sections in Genesis. Again, just brief sections. Genesis chapter 18, and we'll have someone read verses 20 through 21. And then someone else read Genesis chapter 19, verses 12 through 29. And again, there's a lot more that we can read concerning these two cities, but I think we'll get enough context here from these sections. First one, Genesis chapter 18, verses 20 and 21, please.
And the Lord said, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grave, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry against it that has come to me. And if not, I will know.
Okay, so this is, again, in a much larger section about what's going on there. But Sodom and Gomorrah, these cities have already been introduced in Genesis. We already know about them. It's been mentioned quite a bit, especially with what Lot was doing at the time. And this is basically the Lord talking to Abraham and kind of explaining what's about to happen. And the Lord is going to do kind of a final investigation here to see about is what is going on here truly correct? Like, is the sin, that the crying out to me, is it really this bad? I'm going to investigate this, and I'm going to make a final judgment against it, as it turns out. And then we see that come into play here as it unfolds. Chapter 19 now, whoever's got verses 12 through 29, please. Chapter 19, 12 through 29.
Then the men said to Lot, have you anyone else here, son-in-law, your sons, your daughters, whomever you have in the city, take them out of this place. For we will destroy this place, because the outcry against them has grown great before the face of the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. So Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law, who had married his daughters, and said, get up, get out of this place, for the Lord will destroy this city. But to his sons-in-law he seemed to be joking. When the morning dawned, the angels urged Lot to hurry, saying, arise, take your wife and your two daughters, who are here, lest you be consumed in the punishment of the city. But while he lingered, the men took hold of his hand, his wife's hand, and the hands of his two daughters, and the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and set him outside the city. So it came to pass, when they had brought them outside, he said, escape for your life. Do not look behind you or stay anywhere in the plain, except in the mountains, lest you be destroyed. Then Lot said to them, please know, my lords, indeed now your servant has found favor in your sight. You have increased your mercy, which you have shown me by saving my life. But I cannot escape to the mountains, lest some evil overtake me and I die. See now, this city is near enough to flee to. It is a little one. Please let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my soul shall live. And he said to him, see, I have favored you concerning this thing also, in that I will not overthrow this city for which you have spoken. Hurry, escape there, for I cannot do anything until you arrive there. Therefore the name of the city is called Zoar. The sun had risen upon the earth when Lot entered Zoar. Then the Lord rained brimstone and fire on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of heaven. So he overthrew those cities, all the plain, all the inhabitants of the cities, and all that grew on the ground. But his wife looked back behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he stood before the Lord. Then he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah, and toward all the land of the plain, and saw, and behold, the smoke of the land which went up like the smoke of a furnace. cities of the plain, that God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had dwelt.
Okay. So again, there's a lot more to the story that we could go through, but I think we've hit kind of the major points. God, as we talked about in chapter 18, he's heard a cry, he's heard and he knows about this sin, he's making a final investigation, if you will. And then in chapter 19, he declares his judgment, and that judgment is pretty severe. The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed in a very powerful fashion. I don't think that's an understatement. There's nothing left of it, basically. And these were not some minor little dinky towns. These were major cities of the day. And they were both completely destroyed. And there's a lot we can talk about when it comes to Lot and his actions and the actions of his family members. I don't want to get too far into that because that's not the main subject matter that Jude is referring to. But these cities of Sodom and Gomorrah become very much a symbol throughout the rest of the Bible of an example of a place of total sin that God will bring judgment against. And in fact, if you go to 2 Peter chapter 2, we see 2 Peter, or we see in 2 Peter the same kind of thing. I'll read real quick. 2 Peter chapter 2, and I'm going to read verses 6 through 9, where Peter says, if he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah by burning them to ashes and made them an example of what's going to happen to the ungodly, and if he rescued Lot, a righteous man who was distressed by the filthy lives of lawless men, for that righteous man living among them day after day was tormented in his righteous soul by the lawless deeds he saw and heard. If this is so, then the Lord knows how to rescue godly men from the trials, from trials, and to hold the unrighteous for the day of judgment while continuing their punishment. So, Second Peter chapter 2 goes into a little bit more than Jude does in using the examples of Sodom and Gomorrah, because he makes a divide between the righteous and the unrighteous. He says God knows how to punish those who are unrighteous, who are willfully sinning, doing terrible things, and he can rescue those who are righteous as long as they continue to be with him, which maybe is a little bit of a stronger kind of emphasis than Jude puts, but Jude is making this same kind of reference. So I think the people who would be reading this would understand the point that Jude is trying to make here. There was a man who was rescued from a very bad situation, and those that were ungodly, those that were sinful, were punished for it. So I think the purpose in Jude using these cities, including them in here, and much similar to a lot of these that we're going to talk about, is that you don't want to be among the unrighteous. You don't want to be among these sinners. You don't want to be in the camp of the ungodly. You want to make sure that you are being righteous. You are doing what's right. And he's going to talk a lot more about that in verse 17 when he talks about how they need to be reacting to this issue that he's bringing up about these ungodly people that have come into the church. So there's probably a lot more we can talk about that. That's kind of all I've got to say for that, but I'll take any comments or anything on verse 7 of Jude. Go ahead, Jeff.
Lot has so many negative lessons in his life. We don't think of Lot as a righteous man. And in fact, it's very hard, even after Peter tells you he was a righteous man. Say, really? Really? But he is an example of the fact that it isn't the number of good deeds you do, although we certainly need to strive to do every good deed we have opportunity to do. It's the fact that you don't give up, you don't quit. And for all of Lot's failings, he had many. He didn't give up. He kept going. And he did some terrible things that I think no one of them, but the weight of all of them probably equals what Peter did or what David did, but he didn't quit. That's the main thing. And I think that's the greatest lesson we can learn from Lot. We can be righteous. Not that we need to let ourselves do terrible things or take liberties with our bad decisions. It's just that we shouldn't give up and just say, well, I've messed up so bad now, there's no hope for me. There's never that situation. I need to keep trying, keep working.
I would say Lot was probably a man who didn't have good foresight into some of his actions, and so that led to some bad decisions. But he was, and even in the example in Genesis, when I'm going to say the angels, because we just described, well, were they men or were they, angels described as men? the men, the angels that went into the city of where Lot was, and he brings them in saying, you shouldn't be out here. He knows the sinful stuff. He knows the bad stuff. And 2 Peter mentions that too. He knows it's bad out there, and he's trying to shelter them from it. So I look at that and saying, well, there's a righteous man trying to do the right thing in a really bad situation that he's got himself into. Now, he doesn't have the foresight to see what's about to be happening here. And he has other problems that happen after this too, which we can, again, Lot is a whole nother study in itself. But this is one of these examples that maybe we need to think about some of our actions sometimes, even if what we do is not necessarily sinful. Was there anything sinful or wrong about Lot pitching his tent towards Sodom and Gomorrah? Not necessarily. There was nothing, I don't think he had any ill intent. He saw that the land was good, and he probably thought, this would be good for my flocks and everything, and, we'll be able to have a good, prosperous lifestyle. That was probably his mindset. He didn't think about perhaps what the righteous ramifications would be, as far as the eternal soul. Think about how his daughters were betrothed to men of the city, the brothers or the sons-in-law to be, who thought that Lot was out of his mind, and they're like, what's wrong with you? His daughters are going to marry those men. Think about that. That was probably not a good decision. Now, of course, that didn't follow through, but he made some poor judgments. But I think he was trying to do the right thing. He just didn't think things through very well all the time. And again, there are other examples of that. Peter was very much the same way in the gospel. So something for us to consider.
I want to mention one more thing about Lot.
Okay.
He seemed to me to have been a fatally optimistic person who tried to see the good in everyone and was not willing to admit the bad because he knew where he was living was bad, and he just continued to hope for better things. And he does terrible things, but continuing to hope that things will somehow turn out better. We have to be aware of the dangers and honest about the dangers that are around us, and use good and ask God in prayer for good judgment about these things. I love to be optimistic. I want to be optimistic, but we have to be balanced in how we see other people. There is evil. Men allow evil in their hearts. Yes, they still have potential for good, but we can't be blind to the potential for evil too. And, we just want to be balanced in how we treat others, looking for hope, hoping for better days, looking for and encouraging better things, but very much aware of the dangers it could be to our children, to our husbands and wives, and to the church and things like that.
Yeah, and we could say that's a bit of, just naivete on Lot's part, but I would say Abraham had a little bit of that too. And you go back to chapter 18 of Genesis, where he's asking, well, for X number of people that are righteous in this evil place, would you spare the city? And God says yes. And then he gets to smaller and smaller increments. And well, obviously God never saw that smallest increment because he destroyed those cities. It was just Lot and his family. That was it. If you take his wife out of the equation, only 3 of them made it out total. Of the whole city, only 3. I guess the wife probably got out of the city and then turned back, so maybe 4. Count that however you want. Still not sufficient for what God was looking for. So, we should be optimistic, but we should be realistic. Go ahead, Arnold. You've had your hand up.
I just want to mention that we see the patience of God. And he, gives you an opportunity to do what he obeyed. And Lot had many chances. He didn't really have to listen to it, but he listened and he was allowed to do as he wanted to do. But ultimately, he obeyed God and went on out of the city.
Yeah, in Genesis 19, it mentions the mercy that God had for Lot. Lot really kind of dragged his feet getting out of there. He's told, get out of here. Anyone you've got, take him and go. And he kind of goes on these little side trips a little bit. Like, oh, I don't want to go to the mountains. Can I go to this little tiny village over here? Can I go there instead? Or I got to get my sons-in-law to be out. And, they're trying to get him out. And he has this whole conversation with them. And who knows how long that really lasted in real time. We're not given enough information on that. But he doesn't do what he's told right away, it seems. But they have to go and take them out of the city. So we probably don't know everything that he was doing. We were just given the highlights. But it seems he was kind of dragging his feet there. And we should not be bitter about that when, not in this case because none of us really know Lot, personally, but we shouldn't be bitter about that toward people we do know. When we see, they get chance after chance and, mercies after mercies, because we get the same thing. We don't look at ourselves and say, well, I'm a bad person and I'm really glad that, God saw to save me and give me these chances. It's easier for us to look at other people and say, well, look at how bad that person's been, or look at that mistake, and why is God having such patience with them? And we don't look at ourselves in the same sober judgment. We have to be very careful about that. So when people are noticeably trying and they're having a hard time, they're falling, it's not us to judge and say, well, why is God having mercy on them? It's our role to go and help them. And maybe they don't want our help. We can offer that. Maybe they don't want our help. Okay. But we should not be the bystander that points and says, God is wrong here. That's a dangerous path to take. Okay. Anything else on verse 7 there? Okay. I'm going to get into some interesting verses. I mean, I say interesting because commentators go all over the place with these kind of verses. To me, it's not that. Anyway, verses. We're going to talk about verses 8 through 10 here. They all run together, so I'm kind of blocking these together in how we talk about them. Again, these points are made because Jude is trying to bring up examples or talk about the issues of these ungodly people. So just keep that in context when we read through these. So he's talking about how these ungodly people, they adulterate their bodies, they're rejecting authority. Your translations will vary on this. So some will, they hurl abuse on celestial beings or dignitaries. It seems like the idea here is that they're having these, they're like cursing higher spiritual beings, basically. That's probably the best way I would think about that. They speak falsely about what they don't understand. He goes into some detail about that also in verse 10. And then we have this really interesting example here about this sort of, this face-off between Michael the archangel and then and his face-off with Satan. And it talks about how Michael doesn't go and say these things or make these accusations against Satan. He says, the Lord rebuke you. He doesn't say anything from his standpoint, which I think is really interesting because I think this indicates that angels, even Michael the archangel, supposed to be one of the greatest, he's doing nothing of his own authority. The only thing that the angels did was by the authority of God. So when he says, the Lord rebuke you, he's not saying this is my judgment. He's saying this is God's judgment of what you are doing. I think this is a really important thing that perhaps Christians should look at and emulate, because so often this is my judgment on this particular whatever, fill in the blank, it doesn't matter what it is. This is my judgment on this. And we go with that and we don't think, well, what is God's judgment on this issue? I think this is not a new thing, but it is something that's absolutely prevalent today, is people look at what they think God should be or what Christendom should be based off of their own ideology, based off of what they want it to be, what they think is right, their own sense of, their own moral compass, whatever you want to call it, and they're not looking at what God says in Scripture. I think that's dangerous because then it's no longer following God, it's just following whatever I feel I want God to be. That's basically every human mythology that's ever existed, is if I want a certain thing, I'm going to make a God in the likeness of that thing. And that's when everything goes off the rails as far as false doctrine. We need to be very careful about that. I think that is something that we should always look at. So when someone says, well, you don't have a right to judge me about whatever thing that they're doing, I can say, well, it's not my judgment. This is what God says here. And if they think, well, that's just your opinion, man, about how that should be interpreted, that should be an opportunity for a conversation, not a confrontation. Because the last thing we want to do is say, no, you're wrong, I'm right. It should be, you're in sin, and God is telling you how to make it right. It should not be about us. It should be about their relationship to God. I think we need to kind of separate ourselves out from that a little bit because it's easy to get emotionally invested in those kind of confrontations. One other thing I want to talk about in this verse 9 here, It talks about how they were contending for the body of Moses. Now, does anyone know what verse in the Bible Jude is referring to here? This is a little bit of a trick question. It's not mentioned anywhere, as far as I know, anywhere in any other place in the Bible. So this is kind of and we're going to have this come up again later too. Jude is referencing something that's not in a biblical text here, and I'm going to try to explain it the best I can with what very little knowledge I have of the subject matter. So if you're interested, please do some more study. Don't take my words for all truth here. It seems that Jude, that is, he's making a reference to an extra biblical text known as the Testament of Moses. Sometimes it's called the Assumption of Moses. The text is supposed to contain the secret prophecies that Moses passed on to Joshua before he died, basically. It was kind of his last words to give to Joshua. That's not included in the Bible. It's a separate text. It's believed to have been written in the 1st century AD. So that's automatically kind of a little bit of a red flag just because it's so much later. But then Jude is referencing it. So I don't know how to take that. I'm being honest. I don't know what he's, anyway, let me talk a little bit more about this text. There's only one copy that exists still. It's a 6th century Latin copy of this, but a third of that text is missing. And it's supposed that what Jude is referring to with this confrontation between Michael and Satan about the body of Moses is in that missing third. So we don't really know if it's supposed to be in there or not, at least from what I can tell, because I can't find any source that will say this is how we know it's from that. But that's kind of the assumption that scholars have made. And I don't really know how they know that. So again, if you're really interested, do some more research. I just kind of did a quick kind of shallow dive into it. I was like not thinking I would get anywhere if I kept going. But it's an interesting reference that he makes. And because he makes that reference, I want to at least assume that this confrontation that he's referencing, maybe not the entire text of the Testament of Moses, but at least perhaps this confrontation did happen. Otherwise, it wouldn't be in the Bible, I would believe. So he's making this reference that's not biblical. So if you're looking for verses in the Bible, you're not going to find it, which makes this a little difficult. But again, I think the example here is interesting, that this situation, whatever it is, body of Moses, whatever it's going to be, this is not my judgment. This is the Lord's judgment. The Lord will rebuke you for this. 2 Peter does do something similar in 2 Peter chapter 2. I do want to read that also. It's almost beat for beat, but it doesn't make the very specific reference that Jude does with Michael and Satan. In 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 10 through 12, Peter says, he says, "This is especially true of those who follow the corrupt desire of the sinful nature and despise authority. Bold and arrogant, these men are not afraid to slander celestial beings. Yet even angels, although they are stronger and more powerful, do not bring slanderous accusations against such beings in the presence of the Lord. But these men blaspheme in matters they do not understand. They're like brute beasts, creatures of instinct, born only to be caught and destroyed, and like beasts they too will perish." So he says a lot of the very same things we see here in Jude 8 through 10, but his version of what Jude puts in Jude 9, 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 11, just says angels and says they do not bring slanderous accusations, which is the same kind of situation that Jude verse 9 has, but does not have that very specific reference that Jude puts in his book. So they're saying the same things. He just doesn't use that very specific example. He just is a little bit more general about angels and how they don't do that kind of thing, which is what happens in Jude verse 9. This particular angel is not bringing this accusation against Satan over the body of Moses. So Jude's just more specific. Again, I don't know much about the text he's referencing, so I can't go deeper than that. But if you're interested, by all means, go ahead and research that. Any comments on that section, Jude verses 8 through 10? Okay. I'm going to move on here. Verse 11 has a whole bunch of examples that he throws in here all at once, all in the same verse. So we get three examples, all 3-in-1 deal. Again, and he's comparing these people, these Old Testament examples, to what's going on with these ungodly people in the church at the time. So one of the examples he has here is Cain. Cain, of course, was the first son of Adam and Eve, but he did not follow God's instructions, and instead he killed his brother Abel. Now, this story comes from Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 through 12. That particular story, there's a little bit more Cain after that, but not too much. I'm not going to go there just for the sake of time. I think that's a pretty well-known set of verses. If you don't, it's Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 through 12. It's a pretty well-known story. But I think it's more interesting to look at how the New Testament talks about that confrontation, because Jude is not the only one that makes reference to Cain in the New Testament. Someone read Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4, and then someone else turn to 1 John chapter 3, and you'll be reading verses 11 and 12. But let's get those in order. So first one is Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4, please.
By faith Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and through it he being dead still speaks.
Now this particular verse maybe is more focused on Abel, but we definitely get Cain mentioned, and we know kind of the contrast here. Abel offered God a pleasing sacrifice. He did what he was told to do. He followed the instructions. Cain is the opposite of that. Cain did not give an offering that was acceptable. And instead of fixing that, if you go back to Genesis chapter 4, God tells him what he needs to do. He instructs him very clearly. You need to not let this hang over you. You need to master sin. You need to get over this, and you need to do what's right. He doesn't. Instead, out of jealousy, he kills his brother. Instead of fixing it, he made things worse. So that's the reference there. The other New Testament example is 1 John chapter 3. Whoever's got that, verses 11 and 12, please.
For this is the message that you heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. Not as Cain, who was of the wicked one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his works were evil and his brother was righteous.
So again, we have the divide here. You have Abel, who is doing the righteous things, Cain, who is not. And again, instead of fixing his own errors, Cain decides he's going to kill his brother, and that's mentioned here. I think this is another thing that we can look at and say, hey, this applies in our lives too. When we see someone doing right and we're in the wrong, naturally, almost instinctively, we say, well, if I get rid of that person, then there's not going to be this difference. There's not going to be this contrast, because there won't be anyone to compare me to or judge against. Again, a very dangerous attitude, because it can lead to stuff like what Cain did in killing his brother. So he's saying these ungodly people are like this. They have this kind of attitude of Cain. The next example that he brings up in verse 11 is Balaam. I'm just about out of time. I'm going to try to finish this verse. Balaam is a character referenced a lot in the Old Testament. He kind of becomes a symbol also for the rest of the Bible. His story is documented mostly in Numbers chapters 22 through 24. We're obviously not going to have time to read all of that. But the summary is here that Balaam was a prophet of some kind. He was not an Israelite. His background is interesting. I won't get too deep into it. But he is summoned by Balak, king of Moab, to come and pronounce curses upon the Israelites who are coming into the promised land, basically. But Balaam was instructed by God to only do what God told him to do, and there's a whole thing about that and how God really put that message there for him to understand. But this causes Balaam to bless the Israelites instead of curse them, and Balak gets really mad about that. There's a whole thing between those two. Now, despite the blessings he proclaimed among the Israelites, it's implied that he was motivated to receive the rewards to curse the Israelites. If you go to Revelation chapter 2, verse 14, it ties him to the tactic that the Moabites used to cause the Israelites to sin in the following chapter, Numbers, and Numbers chapter 25. And I want to also, we're not going to turn to those, but I do want to turn to 2 Peter chapter 2 again, to see what Peter says about that, because Peter says a very similar thing. In verses 15 and 16, he says, "They have left the straight way and wandered off to follow the way of Balaam, son of Beor, who loved the wages of wickedness, but he was rebuked for his wrongdoing by a donkey, a beast without speech, who spoke with a man's voice and restrained the prophet's madness." Again, that's kind of referring a little bit to before he started doing the blessings and stuff with the Israelites, when he's on his way there on a donkey. It's a whole fun story. Not going to have time to talk about that too much. But it says he loved the wages of wickedness. It seems to imply that he wanted the reward that was going to be his from Balak, the king, who had promised quite a bit. But God said, you can only say what I tell you to say. And then that creates the confrontation. And then Revelation chapter 2, verse 14, pretty clearly states that he was the one that came up with the strategy to send the Moabite women into the camp of the Israelites, that caused all sorts of them to die because of the sin, the sexual immorality that was taking place, all sorts of problems there. I'm going to finish the example of Korah, and then we'll be done. The story is Korah's rebellion. Basically, he comes up against Aaron and Moses with a bunch of other people. This is in Numbers chapter 16. They're trying to usurp the authority that had been given to Moses and Aaron. They were destroyed. We're not going to read that story, but it's in Numbers chapter 16, verses 19 through 33. We'll basically give you the summation of it, but we're out of time, so I'm not going to go to that this morning. But in all of these cases, you have someone who could have done what was right, but chose not to, and kind of went their own way to try to do something, and it didn't go well for them. In the case of Balaam, which I didn't mention this, we know that he is killed later by the Israelites. Later on, there's a mention of the casualties. They have a casualty list that they give, and Balaam, son of Beor, is one of the ones listed. It's not like this great romantic, like last stand by Balaam. Oh, no, he's just on the casualty list. That's basically it. So we know he's killed in a violent way. We just don't get detail of that. But it's interesting he groups those together because these people were instructed to do what was right. They knew it was right, but they were not willing to do what was right. And I think this is why he's using these examples to compare him to these ungodly people in the church who have been taught the right thing to do. They've been given the instruction, but they are not willing to do those things. So that's why I think he includes those there. We're going to have to stop there at the end of verse 11. Any final comments or anything before we close up for today? We're just out of time. I was hoping to get a little farther. That's how it always is. Okay. Next week, we're going to pick up then in verse 12. We'll kind of wrap up this section, and we'll kind of finish talking about these ungodly men. And then when we get to verse 17, Judah is going to focus on what the Christians need to do in response to the people that have gone in among them and are promoting these ungodly things. So we'll talk about that. I don't know if we'll finish Jude next week. I was kind of planning to, but nothing goes as the plan accordingly, but it's good to have a good discussion, and I just wish we had more time. But we'll stop there. We'll pick up at verse 12 next week. Thank you.